General Hospital spoilers tease that although Marco had risked his own life to save Kristina from the inferno at Charlie's pub, Sonny couldn't silence the gnawing voice in his mind. A voice growing louder with each passing day and feeding on grief, trauma, and a deep-seated fear of betrayal. The aftermath of the fire had plunged Port Charles into a state of simmering unease. But for Sonny, the destruction wasn't just about bricks, ash, or the loss of a cherished place. It was about what it represented. Something had cracked in his world. Natalia was dead. Kristina was shaken. And Marco, the man now lauded by many as a hero, was beginning to seem too perfect. Too poised. Too calculated. At first, Sonny had accepted Marco's rescue of Kristina with solemn gratitude. But the calm in Marco's demeanor, the convenient timing of his arrival, and the fact that he happened to be at the right place at the right moment began to seed a darker theory in Sonny's mind. What if Marco had lit the match? This suspicion wasn't born out of rational evidence but out of an emotional whirlwind. The pain of Natalia's overdose, the lingering tension with Kristina, and the unresolved vendetta with Sidwell made Sonny desperate for someone to blame, someone closer than a faceless adversary. And so Marco, with his connection to Sidwell, suddenly fit into a new narrative. A dangerous one. One where Marco orchestrated the fire as part of a larger scheme, a twisted performance in which he would be hailed as a savior while dismantling Sonny's influence from within. If Marco had done this, Sonny reasoned, it would be the ultimate betrayal. To use Kristina's life as leverage. To destroy Sonny's legacy not with violence, but with public adoration and trust. The theory began to infect Sonny's every action. He started replaying every interaction with Marco, dissecting every word, every glance, every hesitation. He began pressing Brick and Spinelli for surveillance footage, financial traces, background checks. He revisited Marco's connection to Natalia and wondered if there was an undisclosed motivation, perhaps vengeance for her death, which Marco might secretly blame Sonny for. Sonny's obsession with this theory became all-consuming, and it began to bleed into his relationship with Kristina. He found himself watching her differently, questioning her responses, suspecting that she might be falling under Marco's influence. The more Kristina defended Marco, the more convinced Sonny became that something insidious was unfolding. Kristina, for her part, remained unaware of the depth of Sonny's suspicions, though she sensed his increasingly erratic behavior. She couldn't understand why her father, who should be celebrating her survival, seemed more distant than ever. The man who once would have moved heaven and earth for her now looked at her as if she were a stranger, or worse, a threat to his crumbling empire. Meanwhile, Marco, still grieving the loss of Natalia and unaware of the hurricane forming around him, continued trying to support Kristina, thinking he was helping to heal a fractured family. But behind closed doors, Sonny was planning, watching, waiting for one misstep to justify his growing belief that Marco was a wolf in sheep's clothing. The tension escalated when Sonny discovered that Marco had visited Charlie's pub just hours before the fire. There was no clear reason. He claimed he was there for a delivery, a conversation with a friend, but Sonny saw it differently. It was enough. Enough to convince him that Marco had been casing the place, laying the groundwork for a staged inferno. Sonny's mind, once the domain of a sharp strategist, had now become a labyrinth of paranoia. He began testing Kristina's loyalty with subtle traps and leading questions. He even began to isolate her from certain family meetings, claiming concern for her emotional state, but in reality, wanting to limit Marco's access to the Corinthos' inner circle. What had started as a spark of doubt had become a wildfire, consuming Sonny's logic and scorching the bridges he once relied on to hold his family together. Even Ava noticed the shift. Even Carly. They tried to talk Sonny down, reminding him that his grief and guilt might be coloring his perceptions, but Sonny would not be swayed. Not now. Not when he believed there was a wolf in his house. The most chilling part of Sonny's transformation was not just his growing suspicion of Marco, but what he was willing to do to prove it. He ordered a silent investigation into Marco's finances, looking for unexplained income, offshore transfers, encrypted messages. He had detail Marco's movements, report on every conversation, every meeting. And if this spiral continued, Sonny wasn't far from crossing a line he couldn't come back from, framing Marco, or worse, silencing him permanently. In Port Charles, where secrets festered and alliances shifted like sand, Sonny's descent into this new obsession was a reminder of how quickly a hero can become a target, and how easily love can be distorted by fear. The tragedy at Charlie's pub had ignited more than a fire, it had set off a chain reaction of mistrust, vengeance, and emotional warfare. And if Sonny continued down this path, believing that Marco was the enemy rather than the rescuer, he might lose the one person he claimed to be fighting for all along, Kristina. The emotional unraveling between Sonny and Kristina had reached a dangerous boiling point, one that not even decades of familial loyalty and shared blood could cool. The fire at Charlie's pub was merely the spark. What followed was an inferno of suspicion, grief, and betrayal that now threatened to consume the Corinthos family from within. Sonny, who had always seen himself as the protector of his children, now saw one of them slipping from his grasp in the most unexpected and heartbreaking way. And Kristina, long defined by her emotional volatility and quest for identity, had finally found a cause worth standing her ground for. That cause was Marco, the man who had pulled her from the smoke and flames. The man who had just lost his mother to a twisted web of despair and manipulation, and the man Sonny now regarded as a threat. In Sonny's world, nothing was coincidence. There were only moves and countermoves, alliances and betrayals, enemies and pawns. So when the fire ripped through Charlie's pub, Sonny didn't just see smoke, he saw strategy. The fact that Marco was there, ready to save Kristina, and that Natalia's death had followed so closely on the heels of public tension with Sonny, made him suspect something more calculated. He began to believe that Marco was not just a grieving son or a lucky bystander, but a plant. A carefully placed player sent to weaken his family's core and challenge his influence over Kristina. It was a theory rooted not in logic, but in fear, a fear that the life he built, the people he loved, were now tools in someone else's game. Kristina, on the other hand, was living in a completely different reality. To her, Marco wasn't an infiltrator, he was a savior. He didn't come with demands or threats. He didn't ask her to choose sides. He simply showed up when she needed someone the most. While Sonny barked orders and cast suspicions, Marco offered silence and grief, a reminder that not all pain needed to be weaponized. For Kristina, whose relationships had long been poisoned by guilt and control, Marco represented a new kind of love, one rooted in mutual respect and emotional freedom. And Sonny's immediate mistrust of him only proved how incapable her father was of understanding the kind of healing she needed. The clash between father and daughter wasn't loud or explosive, not yet. It was subtle, lingering in cold glances across the Corinthos kitchen, awkward silences at family dinners, and the absence of phone calls that used to happen daily. But the tension was growing. Unbearable and inescapable. Kristina no longer felt safe confiding in her father. Every conversation turned into an interrogation. Every expression of gratitude toward Marco became a declaration of war. And every attempt to explain her perspective was shut down with the same tired phrase, "You don't know who you're dealing with." But Kristina knew. She knew Marco had flaws. She knew his father, Sidwell, was a dangerous man. But she also knew that Sonny was projecting. That his desire to control every outcome and dictate every relationship in her life was suffocating her. The very act of questioning her judgment, of dismissing her intuition, of assuming that she was being manipulated, those were the real betrayals. Marco had risked his life to save hers. And yet, Sonny refused to see that. He refused to acknowledge Marco's pain, his sacrifice, or his humanity. To Sonny, everything was a calculation. And that was the root of Kristina's disillusionment. The final fracture came when Sonny began quietly investigating Marco behind Kristina's back, reaching out to old contacts, pulling surveillance footage, even confronting people from Marco's past. When Kristina found out, she was devastated. It wasn't just about Marco anymore. It was about trust. It was about respect. It was about her right to make her own decisions, even if they weren't aligned with Sonny's sense of control. That moment became a turning point. The look in her eyes when she confronted her father was not one of rebellion, but of resignation. She no longer needed to fight to be heard, because she realized Sonny wasn't listening. Now, the Corinthos household was divided in ways no one could have predicted. Kristina began spending less time at home. She stopped showing up to family meetings. She started volunteering more at shelters, organizing grief support groups in Natalia's memory, and spending quiet evenings with Marco, where they mourned, healed, and slowly rebuilt pieces of themselves. Meanwhile, Sonny grew more isolated, more paranoid. The more Kristina pulled away, the harder he gripped onto the narrative that she was being manipulated, refusing to admit that maybe, just maybe, he was the one pushing her away. Even Carly couldn't deny the rift was real. She tried to mediate, but Kristina didn't want mediation. She wanted autonomy. And Sonny wasn't ready to give that to her. Not after everything he had lost. Not after the chaos he had barely survived. But in his attempt to preserve his family, Sonny was inadvertently driving them further into chaos. He was losing Kristina not to Marco, not to grief, but to her own growth. And that was the most painful truth of all. As the days passed, the silence between father and daughter grew louder. What was once unspoken began to feel permanent. A wall had been built, and neither side knew how to climb it. Sonny remained convinced he was protecting Kristina. Kristina remained certain that Sonny was incapable of seeing her as anything but a child. And Marco, caught in the middle, could only hold on to the hope that the man who raised one of the strongest women he'd ever met would eventually see her for who she had become, not who he needed her to be. In Port Charles, every war has its casualties. And as this emotional battle unfolded, the Corinthos family stood on the precipice of a devastating shift. The question wasn't whether reconciliation was possible, it was whether anyone would be left standing when the emotional dust finally settled. Marco had not come to Port Charles with the intention of destroying a legacy, but in the quiet ruins of Charlie's pub, as the smoke still clung to the edges of memory and grief clouded every breath, he unknowingly triggered a storm that would alter the fabric of the Corinthos family forever. The once unbreakable connection between Sonny and Kristina, forged through blood, pain, and years of mutual survival, was now strained beyond recognition. It began with a single heroic act, Marco pulling Kristina from the flames as Charlie's burned behind them. But what lingered was not just smoke inhalation or trauma. It was the seed of doubt, and it grew like wildfire in Kristina's mind, uprooting years of loyalty and rewriting the very idea of who her father truly was. The narrative had shifted. Sonny, long revered by his children as a flawed but fiercely protective patriarch, now stood accused not in court but in the heart of his own daughter. Marco didn't have to speak ill of Sonny, his quiet dignity, his pain over Natalia's death, his fierce devotion to justice, spoke volumes louder than any accusations. Kristina saw something in him that she had long yearned for in her father, vulnerability without manipulation, strength without domination. For years she had accepted Sonny's brand of love, unquestioning, smothering, laced with conditions. But now, as she watched Sonny's obsession with revenge consume him once more, as he plotted retaliation against Sidwell and ignored the wreckage in their family, Kristina saw clearly. Marco had become the prism through which she saw her father's failings with painful clarity. What was once a subtle divergence had now become a gaping rift. Kristina no longer defended Sonny's temper or excused his darkness. She confronted it. And every confrontation, every standoff, became another hammer blow to the Corinthos dynasty. Sonny, so used to being the sun around which his children orbited, was now watching helplessly as Kristina charted her own course. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for forgiveness. She stood beside Marco, openly, defiantly, and in doing so, she delivered a message that cut deeper than betrayal. She no longer feared losing her father's approval. And Sonny? For all his power, for all his rage, he couldn't control what scared him most: irrelevance. The fire had taken Charlie's pub, but it was Marco who had burned away the illusion that Sonny's love was infallible. The realization that Kristina might never fully return to him, that she might see him now not as a father but as a tyrant in decline, ignited something volatile in Sonny. He began to question everything. Was Marco a pawn of Sidwell? Had the rescue been staged to humiliate him? Had the entire tragedy been orchestrated to break him from within? These suspicions festered, pushing Sonny further into isolation, as allies began to waver and enemies sensed his vulnerability. But perhaps the most devastating shift was not in Sonny, but in Kristina herself. No longer the restless daughter seeking identity in rebellion or romance, she was now a woman shaped by trauma and determined to heal on her own terms. Marco, wounded and grieving, understood that kind of transformation. Together, they forged a connection that wasn't based on need, but on choice. Kristina chose to stand beside Marco, not in opposition to Sonny, but in pursuit of something freer, something gentler. And that choice sent aftershocks through the community, as whispers of the fire's origins continued to spread. And as Sonny's enemies began to circle with renewed confidence, the Corinthos household teetered on collapse. The rift between father and daughter became a fracture line that ran through every relationship Sonny had built. Carly watched with concern. Dante, ever the loyal son, found himself caught in a silent crossfire. Even Michael, still nursing his own wounds, questioned whether Sonny's thirst for vengeance had finally eclipsed his love for his children. In the end, Marco had done what no enemy, no trial, no gunshot ever could. He had made Sonny confront the truth that his way of loving might be the very thing that was driving his family away. And as the flames of the past continued to smolder, Sonny stood alone at the edge of the emotional inferno, watching his legacy turn to ash, not from betrayal, but from the quiet, devastating power of a daughter who finally saw through the myth of her father. The Corinthos name would survive, but the man behind it was being rewritten in real time, and Kristina was no longer afraid to be the author of that new truth. The final reckoning for Sonny Corinthos is no longer a distant threat, it is rapidly unfolding into a carefully orchestrated collapse, masterminded by none other than Sidwell and his son Marco. What began as a silent campaign of destabilization has now evolved into an all-out war, not with bullets and bloodshed, but with betrayal, legal precision, and psychological warfare. Marco, under the guidance of his father, has succeeded in doing what no rival mobster, no federal investigation, and no act of vengeance could accomplish. He has turned Sonny's own blood against him. Kristina, the daughter Sonny once believed would forever stand in his corner, has crossed a line no one expected. Her loyalty, tested and shattered, now belongs to Marco. And Lucas, long considered a bystander in the family's criminal entanglements, has been drawn into the vortex of destruction, bringing with him secrets that could end Sonny's reign forever. It didn't take much to fracture the family's unity, just truth, strategically revealed. Kristina's horror after the Charlie's pub fire, the death of Natalia, and Sonny's cold dismissal of Marco's grief all formed the emotional ammunition that Marco needed. Slowly, he whispered doubt into Kristina's already wounded heart. He reminded her of Sonny's past betrayals, his violent nature, and his capacity for manipulation. Each revelation was another brick removed from the foundation of trust. By the time Kristina learned that Sonny had indirectly pressured Natalia to the brink, it was too late. Her image of her father had been replaced by a monster in a tailored suit. Marco's empathy, his vulnerability, and his refusal to fight fire with fire made Kristina believe that he, not her father, represented integrity. But the psychological damage wasn't the endgame, it was the beginning. Marco and Sidwell have prepared the ultimate offensive, a legal and media campaign that will expose Sonny's deepest crimes to the world. Spinelli's data systems were hacked. Confidential records from Deception Cosmetics have surfaced. Natalia's flash drive, presumed lost, was recovered and decrypted, revealing fake offshore transactions tied to Sonny's name. Lucas, having been a silent witness to shady dealings meant to cover up financial crimes within the company, has agreed to testify. The smoking gun is not just in the data, it is in the voices of those Sonny believed would never betray him. The courtroom will be Sonny's battlefield, but unlike the streets. He cannot muscle his way through. Kristina is expected to testify, not in defense of her father, but in support of Marco. Her testimony will be personal, piercing, and laced with years of emotional suppression finally unleashed. She will recount her father's gaslighting, his dismissiveness, and his demand for loyalty at the expense of morality. And while Sonny may try to argue that he acted out of love, that he sought only to protect his family, the evidence, cold, factual, and damning, will speak louder than any plea for forgiveness. Carly's silence will be deafening. Michael's distance, no longer subtle. Even Dante, torn between the badge and blood, will be forced to reckon with what it means to uphold justice when your father is the criminal. As the trial progresses, Sonny will watch the pillars of his empire crumble, not from enemies in the shadows, but from the people he once claimed to protect. Sidwell and Marco aren't interested in simple revenge, they want eradication. They want the myth of Sonny Kristina to die publicly, shamefully, and completely. And they will succeed. Not because they are more powerful, but because Sonny's greatest weakness was never his enemies, it was the illusion that his family would always shield him. That illusion has now been weaponized, turned inward, and detonated. When the verdict comes down, it won't just convict a man, it will close a chapter in Port Charles's legacy. The king has fallen. And as Sonny is led out of the courtroom in cuffs, his eyes scanning a gallery of turned backs and stone-cold stares, he will realize that the real punishment is not prison, it is the void left behind when love turns into fear, when loyalty turns into truth, and when the ones you raise choose justice over blood. This is the tragic downfall of Sonny Kristina, not just a man, but a myth undone by the very heartbeats he once called family.